potential land strikes in Venezuela aligned with the president's supporters, the MAGA base? Does it risk the potential for a prolonged war and U.S. troops involved in that?
Prolonged war is definitely not something this president is interested in. He's been very clear about that. He wants peace. He also wants to see the end of illegal drugs being trafficked into the United States and taking the lives of hundreds of thousands of Americans across our country. And he's thinking about that every day here at the White House. With every drug boat that is taken out by this administration, we are saving thousands of lives by deterring those drugs and stopping those drugs from flowing into our country. You will all...
Listen to the obscenity dripping from this spokesperson's mouth and understand what you're witnessing, because this is the moment when the grotesque machinery of American imperialism reveals itself in all its naked vulgarity, when peace becomes war, and war becomes peace, in the most Orwellian display imaginable, when a potential invasion of a sovereign nation gets repackaged as counter-narcotics policy and sold to you with the casual indifference of someone discussing the weather forecast. The U.S. has carried out military strikes on at least 21 Venezuelan boats it claims are trafficking drugs in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific, killing at least 87 people, and the spokesperson stands there spinning this carnage into some benevolent drug interdiction operation, as if blowing boats out the water, and then pivoting to mention a Christmas ball appearance constitutes coherent foreign policy, rather than the fever dream of a declining empire desperately trying to reassert dominance through naked violence. The cognitive dissonance is staggering when you watch this unfold, because every public sign and warning by the president raises the risk that the U.S. is on an inexorable path toward a military confrontation that would represent a big political gamble given the public's antipathy toward new foreign wars. Yet here we are watching a White House mouthpiece normalize what amounts to warmongering while insisting with a straight face that prolonged war is definitely not something this president is interested in, because apparently he just wants peace, a formulation so transparently absurd it would be laughable if it weren't signaling the potential deaths of thousands and the destabilization of an entire region in Latin America. And wait, because it gets so much worse when you understand the full context of what's happening here, when you realize that the Trump administration's seizure of an oil tanker off the coast of Venezuela is one of the most dramatic twists yet in a military pressure campaign against Venezuelan dictator Nicolás Maduro, and Trump has meanwhile repeatedly warned that strikes against what he says are drug trafficking sites on land could start soon, which means we're watching the systematic escalation toward a full military intervention being normalized in real time through bureaucratic doublespeak about saving American lives from drugs. The historical echoes are deafening when you recognize this playbook, because critics of the Trump approach have drawn comparisons to the U.S. failure to prepare for regime change in Iraq in 2003, after the U.S. invasion, and we all know how that catastrophe played out, how the promises of quick liberation turned into decades of occupation and death, and the empowerment of extremism. Yet here comes Trump world floating the exact same interventionist fantasy, dressed up in different rhetorical clothing. The reporter in this clip does something crucial by directly asking whether this aligns with the MAGA base, whether it risks prolonged war, and the spokesperson's response is to simply evade the question entirely, to pretend it wasn't asked, to pivot to drug war talking points, as if repetition of the phrase saving thousands of lives makes the prospect of bombing another country somehow defensible or coherent with anything resembling an America First worldview. This is where the ideological contradictions of the MAGA movement become impossible to ignore, because the president's approach to Venezuela exemplifies the surge of interventionism, and Trump has authorized at least 21 military strikes since September, killing 43 suspected drug traffickers, in what is framed as a border security campaign against the Cartel de los Soles and its reputed leader President Nicolás Maduro, with Secretary of State Marco Rubio having steered this hawkish line, reframing regime change around oil access and anti-cartel operations. So much for America First, so much for ending forever wars, so much for the isolationist promise that supposedly animated Trump's political rise, because what we're witnessing instead is what began with a simmering debate over the meaning of America First has erupted into open warfare, driven by Trump's aggressive maneuvers on Ukraine, Israel, Venezuela, and China, and conservative media and platforms like X and Rumble have amplified the split, exposing a movement once unified by loyalty to Trump, but now divided between isolationist purists and interventionist hawks. The fractures are real, and they're growing, and they expose the fundamental emptiness at the heart of MAGA foreign policy, which has always been less about actual restraint and more about strongman posturing combined with selective racism about which countries deserve American attention and which populations are expendable in the pursuit of vague notions of American greatness. Watch how the drug war becomes the all-purpose justification for imperial adventurism, because Trump has provided no evidence of drug trafficking, and experts say Venezuela is not the main source of drugs such as cocaine being smuggled into the U.S., which means the entire premise of this escalation is built on fabrication and misdirection. Venezuela is not the hub of narco-trafficking. That is a route which begins in neighboring Colombia and ends on the U.S. border in Mexico, and Venezuela has been a facilitator, even permitting its territory to be used to launch the planes that carry Colombian cocaine north, but it is at worst a tenth of the problem, not its heart, so the obsessive focus on Venezuela reveals motivations that have nothing to do with actually addressing drug flows into America, and everything to do with geopolitical domination and resource extraction. The Venezuelan government itself called this out explicitly when government statement said it is not migration, it is not drug trafficking, it is not democracy, it is not human rights, it has always been about our natural wealth, our oil, our energy, the resources that belong exclusively to the Venezuelan people. And while you might dismiss that as propaganda from an authoritarian regime, the evidence for American imperial designs on Venezuelan oil is overwhelming when you remember that former Deputy Director of the FBI, Andrew McCabe, quotes Trump as saying of Venezuela, "That's the country we should be going to war with. They have all that oil and they're right on our back door." And Trump stated in June 2023 at a press conference, "When I left, Venezuela was about to collapse. We would have taken over it. We would have kept all that oil." The mask slips entirely when Trump says the quiet part loud, when he openly fantasizes about conquering Venezuela and keeping all that oil, but somehow this gets memory hold in our discourse, as we're told to focus on the supposed drug menace and accept military strikes as legitimate counter-narcotics operations, rather than what they transparently are, which is the groundwork for regime change and resource theft. The legal and moral bankruptcy of this entire enterprise becomes even clearer when you understand that experts, human rights groups, and international bodies said the killings were illegal under U.S. and international law, and the Colombian and Venezuelan governments have accused the U.S. of extrajudicial murder. Yet Congress has been unable or unwilling to stop this, because as of 6 November, the U.S. Senate has twice rejected resolutions that would limit Trump's authority to continue military action against Venezuela or airstrikes against alleged drug vessels. The bipartisan support for imperial violence is stunning in its consistency, proof that the so-called resistance to Trump among Democrats extends only as far as cultural issues and rhetoric, but collapses entirely when it comes to challenging American military supremacy and the right to wage war wherever and whenever our political class deems it convenient. A group of Democratic and Republican U.S. senators filed a resolution that would block U.S. military action against Venezuela without congressional approval, after Trump said a land campaign would begin shortly, but U.S. troops have carried out at least 21 strikes on alleged drug boats in the Caribbean and Pacific since early September, killing at least 83 people, which shows some small resistance from principled legislators like Tim Kaine and Rand Paul, but the broader picture is one of Congress abdicating its constitutional war powers and allowing the executive branch to wage undeclared war based on fabricated pretenses. And now we need to talk about what happens if this actually escalates to land strikes or invasion, because while some policymakers in Washington hope a military strike would trigger a political transition in government, analysts warn it is far more likely to plunge the nation into instability, and one analyst described the idea of an attack as opening a Pandora's box, noting that armed actors are empowered in a conflict, that are either the military itself or paramilitary actors, whether they're politically motivated or just organized crime, could try to take over certain parts of the country. The utter lack of planning for what comes after Maduro is chilling, because CNN reported that the Trump administration was working on plans for what would happen in Venezuela in the event that Maduro fell or left. Critics of the Trump approach have drawn comparisons to the U.S. failure to prepare for regime change in Iraq in 2003, and some analysts fear that Venezuela could descend into violence and instability if the Maduro regime falls, and that it could prompt a refugee crisis. We've seen this movie before, and we know exactly how it ends, with American military superiority achieving the immediate tactical objective of removing a government, followed by total chaos and suffering for the civilian population, followed by American forces either getting bogged down in counterinsurgency or simply walking away and letting the country burn while refugees flee by the millions seeking safety. About 7.9 million Venezuelans, roughly 28 to 30% of the population, have required humanitarian assistance in 2025, and against that backdrop, a U.S. attack would likely be experienced less as a moment of liberation and more as yet another layer of insecurity, one that threatens what remains of access to food, medicine, electricity, and basic services, which means any American intervention would immediately worsen a humanitarian catastrophe that already has millions suffering under sanctions and economic collapse. The most infuriating dimension of all this is watching how the MAGA movement's supposed opposition to forever wars evaporates the moment Trump decides he wants to play strongman in Latin America, because this behavior poses a problem for his core political base, and many of the voters who backed Trump for a second term did so out of a belief that he would withdraw America from costly global misadventures and focus on domestic renewal, but now they see a president increasingly embroiled in foreign dramas, often of his own making, and sometimes with alarming opacity, and the promise to end forever wars is being replaced with strategic ambiguity and transactional engagement. The ideological incoherence is stunning when a poll from the Ronald Reagan Institute finds that self-described MAGA Republicans believe it is extremely important for the United States to lead on the world stage, and they love the way Trump is leading, and the poll shows that MAGA Republicans are more hawkish and less isolationist than any other group in America, including Democrats, independents, and establishment Republicans, and not only do they reject a Fortress America approach to foreign policy, they want even bolder U.S. leadership from Trump. So it turns out the MAGA base was never actually isolationist. They were simply opposed to wars conducted by establishment politicians they didn't trust, but give them a strongman they worship, and suddenly bombing boats and threatening invasion becomes peace through strength and defending American interests rather than the warmongering it actually represents. This brings us to the central hypocrisy that needs to be named and confronted, because the president's approach to Venezuela exemplifies the surge of interventionism. Trump has authorized at least 21 military strikes since September, killing 43 suspected drug traffickers in what is framed as a border security campaign, and Secretary of State Marco Rubio has steered this hawkish line reframing regime change around oil access and anti-cartel operation. Yet somehow this gets packaged and sold as consistent with America First principles when it's actually a return to the worst traditions of American imperialism in Latin America. From Latin America and the Caribbean's vantage, the Trump administration's reboot often looks more like a hemispheric strategy than a counter-narcotics policy, and label cartels as terrorist organizations, and Washington can sanction, seize, and strike, decertify a partner, and leverage over aid, trade, and security cooperation expands, and fold narcotics into terrorism, and the Pentagon's toolkit becomes fair game, which exposes how the war on drugs has always been a convenient mechanism for military intervention and control, dressed up as law enforcement and public health policy. The designation of cartels as terrorist organizations is particularly sinister because it allows the administration to bypass normal constraints on the use of military force and treat law enforcement matters as national security threats requiring kinetic military responses, which is exactly how you get at least 87 people killed in at least 22 strikes on 23 vessels, as of 4 December 2025, with minimal oversight or accountability and no declaration of war. Listen to the casual sociopathy and how Trump officials discuss this violence, because Trump announced the first attack from the White House, describing the target as loaded with narcotics. He stated the operation killed 11 members of Tren de Aragua, and Secretary of State Marco Rubio confirmed the sinking on social media, stating the vessel was operated by a designated narco-terrorist organization, and said instead of interdicting it, "On the president's orders we blew it up, and it'll happen again." The bloodlust is right there on the surface. The glee in announcing that boats were blown up and people were killed. The promise that it'll happen again, delivered with the swagger of someone announcing a successful marketing campaign rather than extrajudicial killings in international waters. And the lies are so transparent when you see that drug overdose deaths in the U.S. in 2024 were about 80,000 according to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, representing a 25% decline from the previous year. Yet Trump repeatedly claimed deaths were 300,000, and when speaking to reporters he inflated that number to 300 million, which means Trump is fabricating a crisis by inflating death statistics by orders of magnitude to justify military action that has nothing to do with actually reducing drug deaths in America, and everything to do with flexing military power and pursuing regime change objectives. The intersectionality of crises becomes impossible to ignore when you recognize how the new war on drugs has yielded no economic benefits for Latin America. Trump's approach hasn't included major aid packages like Plan Colombia or the Merida Initiative, but has instead relied on coercion and diplomatic pressure, and by externalizing the costs of drug enforcement, the U.S. has effectively shifted the burden to Latin American nations while dismantling key agencies like USAID that once addressed structural drivers of organized crime and irregular migration. So Trump simultaneously destabilizes Latin American countries through military pressure and economic strangulation, while also demonizing migrants fleeing the very chaos American policy creates, completing a vicious cycle of imperial violence and xenophobic scapegoating that serves to consolidate authoritarian power at home while extracting resources and compliance abroad. The connectivity of these systems is what we must emphasize when we're trying to build solidarity across movements, because the same militarism that threatens Venezuela is intimately connected to border militarization, to police violence, to the carceral state, to environmental destruction, to the bleeding of resources away from healthcare and education and housing into the bottomless maw of the military-industrial complex. What makes this moment so dangerous is not just the immediate threat to Venezuela, but how it normalizes the next intervention and the one after that, because a new U.S. war or concentrated military action abroad would contradict one of the president's core foreign policy principles, the avoidance of new overseas conflicts, and multiple polls show Americans are opposed to a strike on Venezuela, with a CBS News survey finding 76% didn't believe that Trump had explained his position, and only 13% saw the country as a major threat to U.S. security. Yet none of that matters because public opinion can be manufactured, and consent can be engineered through repetitive invocations of threats and drugs and terrorism and national security. The spokesperson in this clip is doing exactly that work of manufacturing consent by refusing to engage with the substance of the question about prolonged war, and instead retreating to formulaic talking points about drug interdiction and saving American lives, banking on the idea that repetition and emotional manipulation will override critical thinking and historical memory about how these interventions always play out. And we need to be crystal clear about what progressive resistance to this looks like, because we must oppose the many dangerous and inhumane policies that Trump has promised, including mass deportations, a new Muslim ban, war with Mexico, the imposition of new sanctions on a whole range of countries, and the general recklessness that brought our country to the brink of war multiple times during his first presidency. But we can't just play defense, and progressive Democrats need to offer a genuine alternative vision for our country's role in the world, one that recognizes that our security and prosperity are bound up with the security and prosperity of communities around the world, and therefore seeks to build a more equitable and solidaristic global community. The resistance cannot simply be reactive opposition to Trump's specific policies, but must articulate a fundamentally different understanding of American power and purpose in the world, one that rejects imperialism and militarism, not just when Republicans are in charge, but as a systemic problem that transcends party politics. In 2024, as in 2016, Trump notably benefited from the unwavering militarism of his Democratic opponent, and the runaway militarism of the last quarter century was a crucial factor in making President Trump possible, even if it goes virtually unmentioned in mainstream media and political discourse. And that silence is particularly notable among Democratic leaders who have routinely joined in bipartisan messaging to boost the warfare state that fueled the rise of Trumpism, which means the Democratic establishment is complicit in creating the conditions for Trump's militarism, even as they performatively oppose him on other grounds. The resource extraction dimension cannot be separated from the military dimension, because what Trump is ultimately after in Venezuela is not some abstract victory in the drug war, but concrete control over Venezuela's economic instability, which is rooted in years of harsh sanctions as well as its reliance on oil. And when Trump openly fantasizes about taking Venezuela's oil, when his own former advisors quote him saying we should go to war with Venezuela because they have all that oil, we need to connect those dots and understand this as the latest chapter in a long history of American resource wars, dressed up as humanitarian interventions or security operations. The fact that the vessel called the Skipper was seized in international waters and was carrying Venezuelan crude, and a federal judge had previously issued a warrant for its seizure because of alleged links to Iran-backed terror groups, reveals how terrorism designations become all-purpose tools for seizing assets and enforcing sanctions regimes that amount to economic warfare against civilian populations, while claiming the moral high ground of fighting terrorism and drugs. Watch how quickly the rhetorical pivot happens from drug war to Christmas ball, because that's not an accident or a gaffe, but rather reveals the underlying reality that none of this is actually serious policy based on strategic thinking or humanitarian concern, but is instead spectacle and performance designed to project strength and dominate news cycles. The spokesperson can move seamlessly from discussing potential military strikes to promoting Trump's social calendar, because for this administration, foreign policy is just another aspect of the personal brand, another opportunity for theatrical displays of power without any genuine consideration of consequences or alternatives. Trump's foreign policy is the use of diplomacy, military leverage, and international spectacle to center Trump himself as a global brand. He does not aim to reshape the world order based on U.S. national interest, but rather to project himself as its most indispensable character, the deal-maker, the peacemaker, the strongman who can bring adversaries to heel and allies to heel harder. And in this model, foreign policy becomes theater, and Trump is always the lead actor, which explains why the spokesperson can discuss war and peace in the same breath as social events, because they're all just content, all just opportunities to center Trump and reinforce his image as the decisive actor around whom all global events revolve. The most horrifying prospect is what happens when and if this does escalate to land strikes, because Trump said his administration could attack accused drug traffickers who traverse Latin America by land very soon, which would mark an escalation in the U.S. military's campaign of lethal strikes on alleged drug boats. And if the president takes the step of ordering strikes on targets within Latin American countries, it would significantly expand the Trump administration's anti-drug trafficking operations. And once that line is crossed, you're in full-scale military operations on foreign soil, justified by the flimsiest of pretexts and constrained by essentially zero legal or political accountability. Land strikes would likely face heavy pushback in Latin America, and in response to Trump's comments, Colombian President Gustavo Petro defended his government's anti-narcotics efforts, but warned, "Do not threaten our sovereignty because you will awaken the jaguar," while Venezuelan officials have accused the Trump administration of intimidating the country and seeking Maduro's ouster, which signals how this could rapidly escalate into broader regional conflict with unpredictable consequences for stability throughout Latin America. The Latin American response is crucial because it reveals how American actions are perceived not as benevolent drug interdiction, but as imperial aggression that violates sovereignty and threatens the security of nations throughout the hemisphere, which is exactly why progressive movements in the United States must stand in solidarity with Latin American peoples resisting American intervention, rather than accepting the framing of our government that casts this violence as legitimate law enforcement. The failure of progressive institutions to mount adequate resistance is something that has to be confronted directly because by 2024, when Harris announced her surprise run for president, many progressive organizations supported her candidacy with few if any questions asked. And even as Harris promised a lethal military and refused to meaningfully confront Trump's racist invective directed at Haitian and Latino immigrants, she faced no serious opposition from the left or progressives, and once again the urgency of not allowing Trump to regain the presidency overwhelmed the capacity or willingness to question or criticize the Democratic nominee, let alone exert any pressure on Harris to commit to progressive and left demands. That strategic surrender by progressive institutions when Democrats are in power or running for office means there's no actual opposition to militarism in American politics, just partisan disagreement about who gets to wield the imperial sword, and unless we break that cycle and demand principled opposition to interventionism, regardless of which party is conducting it, we will continue to see American power deployed violently around the world with minimal domestic resistance. The lesser evil logic that dominates progressive electoral strategy has completely gutted our capacity for foreign policy critique, because any criticism of democratic militarism gets framed as helping Republicans, even though democratic militarism directly enables Republican militarism by normalizing the underlying framework of American exceptionalism, military dominance. What we're witnessing in this clip and in the broader Venezuela escalation is the playbook for 21st century American imperialism, which involves the fusion of drug war rhetoric, terrorism designations, economic sanctions, military pressure, and regime change objectives, all wrapped up in the language of law enforcement and border security, rather than the older vocabularies of democracy promotion or humanitarian intervention that lost their credibility after Iraq and Libya. Even with brigade-sized airborne and amphibious reinforcements, the Venezuelan advantage in size and ground firepower is so great that unless the Maduro regime disintegrates, invasion is impossible without much larger ground forces. But if the United States launches air and missile attacks on Venezuela, the targets will reflect deliberate choices to achieve a desired end state, which means the most likely scenario is not full invasion, but rather sustained airstrikes and special operations designed to destabilize and degrade Venezuelan state capacity until either Maduro is killed or forced to flee, or the country descends into civil conflict that provides opportunities for American-backed forces to seize power. That's the model we've seen deployed elsewhere, with varying degrees of success or failure depending on your perspective, and it's the model that seems to be unfolding here, with Venezuela as the testing ground for renewed aggressive American posture toward left-wing governments in Latin America. The absolute bankruptcy of American political discourse is on full display when you recognize that the supposedly anti-war MAGA movement has revealed itself as perfectly comfortable with military adventurism when conducted by their strongman, and the supposedly internationalist democratic establishment offers no meaningful alternative vision beyond suggesting that maybe we should work more with allies before bombing countries, or that the intelligence should be better before we designate groups as terrorists and blow them out of the water. Neither party is offering genuine opposition to empire. Neither is willing to fundamentally challenge the premise that America has the right to use military force anywhere in the world whenever our leaders decide our interests are at stake. Neither is prepared to confront the reality that American power is and has always been imperial power deployed in service of capital accumulation and resource extraction, no matter how many times it gets dressed up in the language of security or democracy or human rights. Until we have a political movement in this country willing to say clearly and unequivocally that American militarism is wrong, that regime change is wrong, that economic sanctions that starve civilian populations are wrong, that blowing up boats full of people in international waters is murder regardless of what cargo they might be carrying, we will continue to see these escalations and these wars and these atrocities committed in our name with our tax dollars. The vision we need to articulate and fight for is one where our security and prosperity are bound up with the security and prosperity of communities around the world, and therefore seeks to build a more equitable and solidaristic global community, a rules-based order, but for real this time, and we need to ensure that the next Democratic administration is committed to a new, more progressive foreign policy consensus, and does not, as Biden did, simply split the difference between Trump and the old consensus. That means demanding an end to sanctions on Venezuela, demanding an end to military operations in the Caribbean, demanding accountability for the killings that have already occurred, demanding that Congress reassert its war powers and refuse to authorize these interventions, and demanding that progressive politicians who claim to represent our values actually resist militarism rather than capitulating to it, the moment they're in power or afraid of being called weak or soft. The stakes could not be higher, because what's at stake is not just Venezuela's future, but their entire trajectory of American foreign policy, and whether there will be any constraint whatsoever on the exercise of American military power in this new era of great power competition and rising authoritarianism. So when you watch this clip, and you hear that spokesperson casually dismissing questions about prolonged war, while pivoting to talk about drug boats and Christmas balls, understand that you're watching the normalization of imperial violence in real time. You're watching how consent for war gets manufactured through banal repetition and bureaucratic deflection. You're watching how human lives get reduced to talking points about interdiction statistics. And you're watching how the supposed America First movement reveals itself as just another iteration of American exceptionalism that believes our country has the right to bomb and invade and overthrow governments whenever we deem it convenient. The fight against this requires building popular consciousness about what American power actually looks like when deployed around the world, requires connecting foreign policy to domestic politics, and showing how the same forces that militarize our borders and our police and our schools are the forces that wage war abroad, requires international solidarity with peoples resisting American imperialism rather than accepting our government's framing of who the good guys and bad guys are, and requires a willingness to be called traitors and America haters and terrorist sympathizers, because that's what always happens when you actually challenge empire rather than just criticizing its tactics or its personnel. This moment demands courage and clarity, and a refusal to accept that there's any legitimate justification for what the Trump administration is doing in Venezuela or anywhere else it decides to flex American military might, and the alternative we offer has to be genuinely transformative rather than just a kinder, gentler version of the same imperial project with better PR.